Fair warning, this video is a bit of an experiment. Sometimes I want to just talk about something to you guys without making a fully fledged video about it that ends up sidelining me or distracting from another project. I've wrestled with how to do this because there is a part of me that wants to put as much effort into things as I can, even if I know that it's not productive in the grand scheme of things. So I want to try putting out some content that is a bit longer, more relaxed, and more podcast-like. I'll probably revisit the idea from time to time to tweak exactly how I want to deliver this kind of content, but for this specific video, I'm just going to be talking about some thoughts I have. Last year, when I heard that Inside Amy Schumer was coming back for a 5-episode limited series, I knew I was going to have to watch it. Since then, a few other things got in the way, but the return of Inside Amy Schumer has been lingering in the back of my mind for a few months. So I decided to open up Paramount Plus and see how terrible it was, if for no other reason than to save you guys the trouble. Let me be honest with you, I was not expecting it to be this bad. I've watched a lot of Amy Schumer content, and this is a new low. Not just for her, but maybe for comedy in general. I'm not exaggerating when I say it's one of the worst things I've ever seen. Sitting through these 5 episodes of quote-unquote comedy was one of the most cringe-inducing, awkward, unfunny, and interminably boring experiences of my life. It was so bad that I struggled to come up with a way to explain it concisely. So I decided to go through each of the episodes in order and give you my thoughts on them. I had to watch them all, so at least you have to listen to me talk about them all. Also, this show is so bad that I think it actually made me sick, so enjoy the dulcet tones of my ravaged vocal cords. Let's start with episode 1. The first sketch from episode 1 is a parody of a commercial for medicine, specifically a psoriasis medication called Flatuda, that is supposed to help Amy get back to her life of making ugly mugs and pottery class. This is already an unoriginal concept for a sketch, but they squander whatever meager potential it might have had. You would expect the medication to have some crazy side effect, like it gives Amy explosive diarrhea or makes her really horny. They didn't go in that direction. Instead, they just don't do anything really. The medication makes Amy a little crabby with her husband, and the big joke is that they have a fight over the fact that he doesn't want to use the ugly mug she made in pottery class. That's it. The second sketch seems to be mocking beauty and lifestyle influencers. You know, the kind who are always talking about mindfulness and expressing gratitude. But the more they talk, the more you realize that they're really terrible people, and the gratitude they're talking about is plastic surgery. As with a lot of sketches from this reboot, I don't know who this is intended to appeal to. I don't know if it's even supposed to elicit laughter so much as mm-hms of agreement from the audience of presumably 37-year-old Medium article readers. That being said, the women that I watched this show with did not find it funny or relatable either. Just cringy. Sketch number 3 is a parody of a Hallmark movie. The classic story of a woman who moved to the big city to pursue her career and then comes back to her hometown for the holidays, only to reunite with her ex-boyfriend. The big reveal here is that her hometown is full of Trump supporters, and her ex is an All Lives Matter supporter. Oh, the horror. I'm not going to say that this sketch was a really fresh idea, but it did have some potential for a funny twist. Instead, Amy fell back on a really weak Trump joke. I'm not saying she shouldn't make fun of Trump, but she had nothing trenchant to say about him or his supporters. The punchline was just, "This town is conservative, ew." It wasted both the potential of the sketch and the potential to make a relevant commentary on Trump, or even Hallmark movies for that matter. Sketch number 4 is blunt and ham-fisted to a degree that is actually kind of hard to fully appreciate. The premise of this sketch is using Colorado as a new term for abortion, and it ends with Amy delivering a completely uncomedic statement about the government taking away the right to abortion. It's so awful and unfunny that it almost made me rethink my position on abortion. The 5th and final sketch is not a good sketch by any means, but it's the one that I feel comes the closest to realizing comedy as well as a coherent commentary on society. The sketch revolves around a group of girls being given their college orientation, which starts off relatively normal before spiraling into the university running cover for athletes who commit SA instead of helping the young women who are the victims. I get what this sketch is going for, which is rare for the show. You have a group of young women who are excited to be going to college and all of the possibilities that opens up for them. But then they're hit with this grim and shocking message that the college is going to do nothing on their behalf if one of the athletes takes advantage of them. It's a subject that is rife for dark satire, but like so many ideas from the show, it is just not properly executed. There is no attempt at subtlety here. The skit hits you over the head with the message that colleges will protect athletes over their female students, and at the same time it's also very tone-deaf. At one point, the woman giving the orientation says, "Every woman for herself," before grabbing a machete and jumping over a sofa. Is this supposed to be serious satire or slapstick comedy? Ultimately, I think it falls short on both accounts. Moving on to episode 2. As bad as episode 1 was, episode 2 was considerably worse. In fact, I'd argue it's the worst of them all. Episode 1 at least had a moment or two that weren't laugh-worthy, but had some iota of humor to them. Like the house with the gratitude women being struck by lightning at the end. This shit is absolutely bereft of humor. It's also the episode where Amy dials up the social and political commentary to its highest level, and that has never been her strong suit. Right off the bat, this episode is terrible, as it starts with a faux commercial featuring Michael Ian Black as an infomercial pitchman for the product called Home Spanx, which are supposed to be Spanx you wear at home, because nobody wants to see your fat body even at home. I'm not saying that, by the way. Michael Ian Black is. Take it up with him. As with many sketches from the show, I don't know what they were going for here. Is it supposed to be criticizing the shapewear industry? Why? What have they done wrong? Is this supposed to be body positive? If it is, that's weird because all they do is make jokes calling Amy fat and gross. Again, maybe it's more relatable if you're an affluent mid-30s white woman without any real problems in life, so you overanalyze the perceived sexism in every commercial you'll see. Sketch number 2, the titular fart park, is just perplexing to me. Amy is walking through the city when she comes across a fart park, which is some kind of government initiative judgment-free zone for farting. She is confused but a little intrigued. The next day, Amy goes back to Fart Park and meets a guy named Josh, who she is immediately enamored with. However, when she goes back to Fart Park for the third day, she discovers that Josh has been murdered by a regular of the park named Harry, who was mad that Josh didn't close the gate. Heartbroken, or fart-broken you could say, Amy screams and farts in anguish. The scene then cuts to Amy, now an author, reading her book, Silent but Deadly, about the murder at Fart Park. To me, this sketch feels like they were aiming for something Mr. Show might do. A sketch that starts off childish and crass, but then unexpectedly changes gears and becomes absurd and ridiculous. She goes to Fart Park, she falls in love, the guy she's in love with is killed, then she becomes an author. Unfortunately, the people writing this show are nowhere near as talented as the writers of Mr. Show, so we just get a bunch of fart noises and a few puns. Following Fart Park, we get another Spanx parody. Yeah, this is a comedy thread that runs through the entire episode. This time, it's sex Spanx. Spanx you wear when you have sex. It's the same premise as the first one, and equally as unfunny and grating. The next sketch is, in my opinion, the single worst sketch from the season. Without exaggeration, it could be the worst thing I've ever seen. It was so bad that I could barely force myself to watch it twice. The gist here is that Amy was a contestant on a reality TV dating show, but the audio from her scenes was bad, so she has to get in the booth and re-record what she said. The problem is that everything she said was extremely embarrassing. It starts with her just saying some mean things about the other contestants, but devolves into anti-Semitism and her crying, throwing up, and, of course, farting. None of which is funny, and it goes on for like 6 fucking minutes. I really cannot explain how bad this sketch is. You have to find it somehow and watch it yourself, because no amount of words can properly explain how uncomfortable this was. It could have had some kind of message regarding the way reality TV stars take part in their own humiliation and exploitation, but it didn't. It was just farting and some offensive jokes. Following this unbelievable turd, we get a brief respite from the suffering with a parody of a horror movie. However, this feels like a concept that was thrown out there in the writer's room and barely fleshed out more than the brief idea of, what do people in Texas fear? A trans girl in a ladies' restroom. It's not funny and it's not biting social commentary, but at least it's short. The next sketch from this episode is the one that I think might have had the best shot of any of them to be both funny and relevant social commentary. It's Amy's first day at her new job, and she's being shown to her office by her boss. In passing, he mentions that every once in a while, a little bit of poison comes out of the air conditioning vents. Amy is concerned about the poison, particularly after she learns it only occurs in her office, but her boss shames and browbeats Amy into being grateful for the fact that she is the first female partner at the company. I think this sketch comes the closest to having a relevant critique of our society. Women are frequently put in situations in the workplace that men do not have to endure. The poison could be a metaphor for many different types of abuse and inappropriate behavior. When women object to these working conditions, they are often ostracized or made to feel as if they're being ungrateful for the opportunity they've been given. That being said, I think this sketch would have been better if it were more subtle. The company is a tampon company, but the boss doesn't understand how periods work. He makes crass comments about her bleeding everywhere, but she's giving too much information when she mentions not getting her period for 10 days. I guess they thought people wouldn't understand that he's a raging sexist otherwise. Oh, and he's also racist and homophobic too. Had they toned this down a bit and played it more dark and dry, I think they could have had a funny sketch with some real social commentary. Instead, they had to beat you over the head with the message that the company is bad because man sexist, man bad. The final sketch is another commercial parody, this time for Skinny Girl Coffins. It's the same concept as the Spanx parody, but even less funny and more annoying. The less said about it, the better. Episode 3 isn't the worst, but it feels the most pointless and lazily written. The first sketch is lampooning Second Amendment activists by having people advocate for their right to own a tank. It's a dumb comparison for two reasons. The first is the fact that most reasonable people would agree that a tank is far more dangerous than a gun, even something like an AR-15 or whatever. The second reason is that you can buy a tank, fairly easily and cheaply in fact, if the barrel is no longer functional. It's more difficult to buy a tank with a functioning barrel, but it's still possible for some people. So, by comparing tanks to guns, Amy is unintentionally making the argument that guns are actually too tightly regulated by comparison. But this is Amy we're talking about, and she's never fully understood even her own political arguments. The draft sketch is just pretty dumb. It's a parody of one of those crime dramas where somebody has psychic powers or can talk to the dead, except Amy's ability is that she can sense where a draft is coming from. It's not actually that bad, in theory, it's just too long-winded. At one point there is a flashback within a flashback to the origin story of Amy's obsession with drafts. I guess it's kind of humorous because it's parodying the convoluted nature of these shows, but it just makes the sketch feel like it's dragging on and on forever. At what point does the parody become worse than the thing it's parodying? I did find the "you smell that" joke funny though. The sleep doctor sketch is just pointless and stupid. It's a commentary on how people can't put down their phones before bed, so they don't sleep well. They really have no other jokes here, so the sketch completely falls apart, and they just start saying "uncut joms," like that Julia Fox meme. This specific sketch may be the nadir of the season, because it feels like the point where things fell apart and they had to give up and move on to something else. The boardroom meeting sketch is a bit better. I'd say it's probably the funniest sketch, and I use both of those terms very loosely, of the entire 5 episodes. At least there is an interesting concept here. I think it's supposed to be a reference to that time Tucker Carlson got weirdly upset over the green M&M becoming less sexy. Or maybe it's some kind of commentary on how various companies are deracializing their mascots. I'm not really sure. Either way, the two pitch people from Raw Dog Advertising want to go in the opposite direction by pitching a new sexy female mascot to the Pillsbury Company. The bit is executed pretty well at first, but then, like most of these sketches, it breaks down into repeating the same joke multiple times, before the Raw Dog crew are taken away by security. There is a slightly funny joke that runs through the scene about how Shaq has some kind of restraining order against them due to an affair, but it's not really germane to the rest of the sketch. The Saint GoFundMe sketch is maybe the only one that accomplishes a relevant or meaningful critique of our society. It is pretty fucked up that our society's healthcare system is so bad that people have to crowdfund medical bills. That being said, the jokes here are mediocre and the critique feels pretty toothless. Like they're afraid to actually call out any of the politicians who are blocking Medicare for all because they're in the pockets of Big Pharma and the health insurance industry. Probably because they'd have to call out people like Nancy Pelosi just as much as the Republicans. So the only people they call out are tech bros for not using their money to lobby for universal healthcare. Weak sauce bullshit. The final sketch from this episode is about anti-Semitism. They're having a meeting about harassment in the workplace, and the head of HR has Amy run through various scenarios. They start off with someone saying Amy looks like she's writing in Hebrew. The head of HR asks what was wrong with that comment, and somebody points out that it was inappropriate to comment on Amy's handwriting. Amy protests that the Hebrew comment was a bit pointed, because she's Jewish. The same kind of scenario plays out several more times, with the comments becoming increasingly more offensive until the other people are just calling her ugly and cheap. This ends when Yamaneika Saunders stands up and says that the comment was anti-Semitic. Amy initially thanks her, but then reverses course and says that Yamaneika shouldn't have to be the one standing up for her. and that her situation is totally different from what black people have to go through. Then Amy starts apologizing for Israel. She's sorry for Bernie Madoff and Bernie Sanders and Weekend at Bernie's, all the Bernies, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein. She apologizes to everyone for being Jewish and then explodes into a cloud of Stars of David. This is another sketch where I'm confused about what the message was supposed to be. Amy asks why everyone feels okay making fun of Jewish people, and a running theme is that her objections fall on deaf ears. On the other hand, the sketch really seems to revel in repeating those offensive tropes about Jews. I guess it's the classic rule that you can make fun of your own, but still, it sends a mixed message. I think the ending of the sketch is supposed to represent how Jewish people often feel pressured to criticize issues like the actions of Israel or Harvey Weinstein that they ultimately have nothing to do with other than some ancient connection through religion and race. But it just feels a bit out of place as part of this particular sketch. Also, I think it would have been a funnier twist if Yamaneika had been the one to make the most offensive remark of them all. Amy is about to say something back only to realize who she's talking to, then starts kowtowing and apologizing. That would have been a more interesting commentary on society and the complex intersection of race and oppression, or whatever they were going for here. But if I were to try to fix all of these sketches, I'd probably end up seasoning my food with rat poison before I finished. In my opinion, episode 4 was the best episode. Granted, that's like saying one brand of drain cleaner tastes better than the others, but the sketches from this episode feel the most fleshed out. At least they aren't all half-baked ideas that somebody threw out there in the writer's room. It also has most of the coherent social critiques of all the episodes. Although, again, given what we're comparing it to, that isn't saying much. The first sketch is still kind of confusing to me though, as I really don't know what they're making fun of. It's a parody of a car commercial where the voiceover guy is nonplussed by Amy's diverse family. She has an adopted Asian daughter, a biological white son, and a black husband. Unlike a lot of the sketches, they don't explain what the joke was supposed to be afterward, so I'm just left confused by this one. Are they poking fun at commercials these days for featuring so many diverse couples and families? That seems a little edgy for this show. With a lot of these sketches, they feel like they're bordering on absurdism, but it's unclear if that was intentional or simply the byproduct of incompetence. Either way, this is one of the more murky and unresolved sketches from the entire show. Sketch number 2 is thankfully more coherent. In this sketch, Amy says, "Aww," whenever she sees a gay couple. It isn't funny, but I can at least grasp who is being made fun of here. People who have a weird and overly romantic view of gay couples. There is unintentional comedy here because Amy keeps seeing the same two gay guys and awing at them. I'm not sure if in the context of this sketch they're supposed to be the same couple, but I find the idea that Amy is creepily following this specific couple around from place to place and awing at them to be kind of amusing. The joke at the end is that Amy was awing at them because one of the guys reminded her of her dead son, but that does kind of undercut the rest of the sketch. Feels like they just didn't know how to end it, so they settled on a half-baked derailment joke that doesn't make any sense. Sketch number 3 is the best sketch from this episode. It's still pretty bad, but in comparison to the rest of the season, which is mind-bogglingly terrible, this seems good. It would be like if you were wandering around the desert for days with no water and you came across a stagnant puddle with a dead rat in it. That would probably be the sweetest drink you've ever had, relatively speaking. The premise of this sketch is that a group of black men are pulled over by a cop and then spray themselves with a perfume that makes them look like white women, or it turns them into white women. I'm not really sure how it's supposed to work, especially because it gets more confusing later. Oh, and the spray is called Privilege. Real subtle writing there, Schumacher. The sketch is not actively cringe or unfunny, but it just isn't funny. I think the humor is supposed to be that they incorrectly say some stereotypical white girl things. Also, the cop is dumb, misogynistic, and racist. While watching this sketch, I was reminded of a few conceptually similar sketches from Key and Peele, but those sketches actually had some unexpected twists to them. The Privilege sketch does not. Once they make the initial joke, it goes in a completely straight line, which I think is a broader problem with a lot of these sketches. Aside from ending sketches with a derailment joke, they rarely have a swerve or twist you didn't see coming. This sketch is also pretty long and meandering, but not in a way that would seem intentional to draw out the tension and awkwardness of the situation, more so just bad writing. The fourth sketch is interesting to me because I'm not sure if even they knew what the political message was supposed to be. Amy is having brunch with another rich liberal friend who mentions that her cleaning lady has a trans nephew, meaning she now has a close connection to a trans person. This makes Amy jealous, despite not knowing anything about trans people, so she lies about having a trans friend of her own. She then tries to find a trans person to be friends with by running through the streets and shouting, "Trans!" until she meets a trans woman named Anne. They hang out for a bit, but Amy ultimately says that Anne being trans makes her uncomfortable and scared, so she asks if Anne would mind going back. In the post-sketch explaining the joke segment, the actress who played Anne says that what she likes about the sketch is that it highlights the micro-prejudices that trans people face on a daily basis. But I don't know. Someone telling you that you should undo a profound decision that completely altered your existence for the better simply because it makes them uncomfortable does not feel like a micro-prejudice to me. More a macro-prejudice. This is another sketch where I don't fully know who is supposed to be mocked or satirized. I guess it's commenting on how a lot of socially conscious liberals want to have trans friends to do performative wokeness, but in reality they view trans people as props or accessories rather than human beings whose feelings matter. But even though Amy sarcastically says that she loves this sketch because it shows that she has a trans friend, I can't help but think there is some genuine truth to that. She may have more in common with the person she is mocking than she would like to admit. The fifth sketch revisits the privilege concept. This time, a black couple is trying to sell their house, so they use privilege to appear as a white lesbian couple, and the realtor ups the value of their house. It's less funny than the first one, but it's also shorter, so that is a plus, I guess. Sketch number 6 is another one with no substance beyond coming across like a line that was pitched during a writing session and never expanded upon. Amy is an astronaut. While the male astronauts are being asked genuine questions about their mission, she is being asked when she plans to settle down and have kids. Again, this is a sketch that isn't objectively bad. It's boring and tediously long given the material it offers. The message is pretty clear and apparent, but as is so often the case when the message is obvious, they beat you over the head with it. The last sketch is somewhat interesting, because until I heard the post-joke explanation, I thought they were going in a different direction. This sketch is satirically advertising a private school that promotes CRT to young kids. At first, it seems like they might be taking the piss out of CRT and mocking schools that teach such complex concepts to 4-year-olds, which would be a pretty controversial commentary from the modern incarnation of Amy. However, after the sketch is over, they make sure to let the audience know that the writers are all pro-social justice, and the sketch was really about poking fun at rich white liberals who sometimes go too far. Episode 5 was the most bland and uninteresting of them all to me. I couldn't remember half of the sketches within about an hour of watching them, so I had to go back and watch them again. The things I do to myself for you people. Sketch number 1 is another parody of a medication commercial. This time, pills that don't make noise when you open the bottle, so people won't know when you're taking them. I feel like this sketch had some potential for good black comedy, but as with most of these sketches, they just repeatedly spell out the joke for you. Like, did you get it? If you didn't, here's the joke again. The pills don't make noise. Did you get it that time? No, well here it is again. It just gets so tiresome. The next sketch is parodying one of those Married a Murderer type of shows on Investigation Discovery or TLC, but the bit here is that Amy is married to a crypto bro. The problem is that they really only have one so-called joke, which is using cryptocurrency lingo and abbreviations like HODL, which I guess is hilarious if you're married to a crypto bro. It's another sketch that isn't actively awful, but it's completely forgettable and doesn't provide anything funny whatsoever. The portfolio sketch is another one that is not strictly bad, but again, it's an example of a sketch that feels like a writer's room pitch that was stretched out to fill an entire sketch. Amy is visiting her portfolio manager to talk about the portfolio that her parents left her after they died in a fire Amy definitely didn't start. Amy wants to do the right thing by divesting from some of the bad stocks until she realizes that she'll have to get a real job instead of living off the money her parents set her up with. Similar to many other sketches from the show, they just repeat the same joke several times but make it slightly worse with each repetition. Amy wants to pretend to be socially conscious, but really deep down she is a greedy and amoral person who sacrifices her principles for financial gain. After the sketch, the writers and cast members joke that this wasn't a sketch. They just filmed a real meeting between Amy and her portfolio guy. But part of me believes that similar to the trans sketch, there is more truth to this joke than Amy would like you to believe. The next sketch is at least somewhat interesting to me, but more so because of what it implies about Amy. Jason Perth, the CEO of media company Klooper, is at a shareholders meeting to announce the creation of their new platform, Klooper Cancelled, which will be hosting all of their controversial talent, specifically Ron "Raw Dog" McQuaid. The sketch is pretty clearly making fun of streaming sites and media platforms for having a double standard about offensive content. They claim to have a zero-tolerance policy when it comes to hateful content, but if you make the company enough money, they will suddenly develop an interest in protecting free speech. This is one of the most relevant sketches from the entire season. We're living in a world where these monolithic tech companies are increasingly controlling what you can say and what kind of media you can consume. If you're a massively popular star like Dave Chappelle or Joe Rogan, you can get away with almost anything, and they will continue to throw money at you. If you're a small-time creator who isn't bringing in tens of millions of dollars, you're basically subject to the whims of the mob, or whatever content monitoring algorithm is currently determining what is considered acceptable speech. The problem, again, is how heavy-handed they are with this sketch. At one point, the CEO says they need to stand back and stand by the free speech of their talent. You know, that phrase Trump said 3 years ago in reference to former bi-curious cereal cartel, the Proud Boys. I'm sure your brain has been poisoned enough by politics to remember that specific sentence. Another issue here is the hypocrisy from Amy. They don't specifically name any names with this sketch, but my immediate thought was that they were referencing Joe Rogan and Spotify. Amy used to be friends with Joe, and arguably more damning was her association with shock jock and racist child groomer respectively, Opie and Anthony. Amy was on their show repeatedly when she was coming up as a comedian, and I don't recall her ever complaining that SiriusXM was platforming their offensive content. As I've pointed out in the past, Amy's entire career was based off monetizing offensive content, then trying to close that door behind her so nobody else can come through. Also, they chickened out after the sketch and made it clear that none of the commentary was referring to the current CEO of Paramount. The final sketch from this episode, and most likely the series, features the return of Tim Meadows in the role of a doctor training would-be gynecologists. He's trying to teach them how long to wait after telling a patient to get undressed before entering the room. Maybe this is a very relatable thing for all the dames out there. I don't know. They really stretched this bit out though, pun intended. The first woman isn't given enough time, so she's still getting undressed when the first doctor comes in, so she panics, trips, and hits her head. Comedy. The second woman, played by Amy, was left for too long, so she becomes basically a feral animal. More comedy ensues. The third doctor enters the room at just the right time. This sketch is borderline passable, at least in the sense that there's a coherent structure and all of that. There are some predictable jokes, like the straight male gynecologist being a pervert. They return to that one a few times. But other than that, it's just a fairly boring but not profoundly bad sketch. But maybe that's just because after watching over 100 minutes of this show, my sense of what is funny and unfunny has become completely fried, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to laugh again. Now, I could probably talk for several hours about why virtually all of the sketches from these 5 episodes missed the mark in one way or the other. But I think it really comes down to a few ideas that I've mentioned repeatedly in this video. When the show isn't actively cringe-inducing, unfunny, or uncomfortable, it's just nothing. I've said time and time again that most of these sketches feel like they were a 1 or 2 sentence idea that was thrown out during a writer's meeting and barely fleshed out to any degree afterward. All they do is tell a joke and then recite a variation of that initial joke with a slight tweak. They rarely ever progress. It feels like when you were a kid trying to meet a page count on an essay, so you would find ways to rephrase the same talking points as many times as you could get away with. To make matters worse, the original idea which they are copy-pasting to fill time is rarely ever funny or interesting to begin with. A lot of the time it just comes across as laziness, such as with the Sleep Doctor / Uncut Gem sketch, where it really felt like they ran out of ideas. As much as I've shit on the show, I tried to give it a fair shot like I do with everything, even things I'm fairly certain will be bad beforehand. Most of these sketches were never going to be good, but some of them had that kernel of potential, something that could have been turned into a funny joke or an interesting commentary on culture, gender, race, politics, media, etc. But they just never managed to clear that hurdle, and I'm not really sure why. There were 19 people who wrote for this season, including, and this is true, Jerry Seinfeld's daughter, Sasha Seinfeld. By sheer probability, you'd think they would be able to come up with some funny bits. But then again, we do have the saying, too many cooks ruin the broth, for a reason. If we look at why so many modern movie franchises suck, it's because they're written by committees and then focus grouped to be as broad and inoffensive as possible. Could that have happened with these sketches? Maybe a few people had funny ideas, but they were either overridden by the rest of the writers or had their ideas mangled by consensus. Perhaps this could also explain why the sketches feel so aimless, and why the messages are so unclear despite the writers coming in after each sketch to clarify what they were trying to convey. Part of the problem also stems from how tired the sketches seem to be. Dated may be the wrong term, but the subject matter feels stuck in that mid-2010s time frame. It's not that the issues they're discussing are completely irrelevant, but there are only a few fleeting attempts to tackle the current political landscape. When they do, it's handled in a dispassionate, almost out-of-touch way that makes you wonder if they actually want to be doing this. You can say what you want about the previous incarnation of Inside Amy Schumer, but I feel like it did have some ambitions at making social and political commentary. It had a little bit of bite, and it was somewhat important to that feminist movement of the previous decade. Even if you didn't like it or disagreed with it, the show was trying to do something. This season feels defanged. It wants to make some kind of point, but it's too tired and afraid to take a proper swing at anything. In the rare occasions that they do come close to making an incisive point, it usually gets lost in the tone-deaf soup of fart jokes and ill-conceived slapstick comedy. I get that this sort of humor was part of the irreverent style of the show's original run, but it's not done well here. Instead of lightening the mood, it undermines the message. Worse still, like in the CRT sketch, they have to immediately pull back to clarify that they're not actually trying to say anything edgy or controversial, just poking a little fun at rich white people. These days, a lot of comedians think that the point of comedy is to offend people. Offending people and pushing boundaries is an aspect of comedy, but it shouldn't be the only goal. Likewise, you can be way too safe with comedy as well. When you never try to push any boundaries, you lose your edge and your engagement with the audience. If you want to make people re-examine their worldview, you do occasionally have to make them feel uncomfortable. You do sometimes have to push the envelope, so that you can then pull back to help people see things from a different perspective. Now, I think it would have been a disastrous idea to have Amy tackle current hot-button cultural issues like trans kids, but if they weren't going to push any boundaries or venture into uncertain waters of any kind, what was the point of this? The show is unwilling to go there. They're unwilling to target anyone other than Donald Trump, and even then it's pretty weak tea. I think it might be part of the broader social changes we've seen over the last few years, where anything that makes people feel uncomfortable in any way is frowned upon in certain circles. I'd be willing to bet that terms like emotional labor were probably tossed around in the writer's room. The show only presents ideas in the most palatable and non-threatening way it thinks the audience will be able to handle. But that raises another question for me. Who was this made for? The original run definitely had a demographic that it appealed to. Middle-class, millennial white feminists. Who is the target audience for this material? I don't know. When you look at how much more extreme the general political discourse is now versus 7 years ago, is there really any appetite for these warmed-over takes from 2015? The show feels frozen in a different time period or disconnected from our current reality. I think it's telling that the show has gone largely unnoticed since it was released late last year. I skimmed through a few reviews that were written when the first 2 episodes came out, and even the people who praised the original 4 seasons were underwhelmed and questioning why it was brought back at all. I do wonder if it was part of some scheme by Paramount to pad out their library of content. Streaming services do that all the time. Take a look at Tubi. You'll find better content buried at the bottom of your septic tank. But we see this with a lot of streaming services. They commission a bunch of content just to fill up their site to help subscribers justify continuing to pay for that subscription. Oh, they made a new season of Inside Amy Schumer. I used to love that show. I have to watch this before I cancel my sub. Then you watch an episode and feel duped. But it doesn't matter because they got your money anyway. Perhaps that's why this season went straight to Paramount Plus instead of Comedy Central. Maybe this is the reason it looks so damn cheap. It was intended to fill up the digital equivalent of the $1 DVD bin. That might help explain why everybody involved with the project seemed to turn in such a low-energy performance. If that's the case, I do feel a bit of sympathy for the writers and performers. On the other hand, if this was really the best they could do, like if they actually put effort into this show and this was the result, I just feel bad for them. And that is without even talking about the Ron Weiner songs at the end of each episode. I didn't talk about them very much because they're so profoundly bad that I really didn't know what to say, other than the fact that I'm utterly confused by their inclusion. Why were they there? What purpose did they serve other than to fill time? Your guess is as good as mine. Nevertheless, Season 5 of Inside Amy Schumer is bad. Truly bad. Unprecedentedly bad. It was mentally and emotionally draining to watch. As I progressed deeper into the season, I started to get this anxiety, knowing that I would have to watch another episode. It was genuinely difficult to put into words how awful these sketches are. How boring, aimless, ham-fisted, and yet lacking in anything meaningful to say they were. They're a waste of time. At the end of my Jeff Foxworthy video, I talked about how it changed my mental scale or barometer for what constitutes bad comedy. This show had the same effect on me, but to an even greater degree. It reminds me of how on the scale we use to rank hurricanes, there is nothing higher than a Category 5, because at that point there is no meaningful difference for whoever is going to get hit by it. A storm with 190 mile per hour winds will level everything the same way that a storm with 160 mile per hour winds will. The difference becomes largely academic and for the record books. That is how I feel about Season 5 of Inside Amy Schumer. It's so bad that you stop judging the sketches and episodes based on other kinds of comedy you've seen, because the comparisons are pointless. You can only judge them compared to each other, because you're in uncharted territory, where the differences are purely academic. That is how bad this shit is. As I said in the beginning, this is something that I want to experiment with for content that I find interesting enough to comment on and share my thoughts with you, but ultimately not devote a ton of time to. It's especially true of something as fucking draining and pointless as this subject, where I don't think I could stomach watching all of it multiple times again while editing. Once was enough. The times I occasionally had to go back to refresh my memory and watch sketches a second time was too much. A third or fourth time would really just be torturing myself. As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. And a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you. Adam and Annie Addis, Jonas Namenson, Rusty Shackelford, Iron Shamrock, Jackson, Fightback CBD, Mike Roballs, Aunt Tifa, Lucky Buddha Beer, There Are Rice Flakes in the Beer, Random Gandor, Fuzi Eunice, Old Neon, Timothy Lee Peterson, Julius Caesar Has Jungle Fever, Zach Taylor, Firebrand, Quasi, Jack Trey Bowles, Snepsts, I Said No Cops, Paulo Gomez, Alex, Kyle, and Neem.